March 5th, 1953. Inside a dacha outside Moscow, Joseph Stalin lies dying from a massive cerebral hemorrhage with his guards too terrified to open the door for hours. Within days, 200 million Soviet citizens will weep in the streets. But deep inside the Gulag, among millions of prisoners scattered across frozen camps, something else stirs, not grief, but quiet, dangerous hope. What happens to a nation built on fear when the man behind it is gone? The answer would unleash uprisings, a secret speech, and a thaw that cracked the Soviet system in ways no one could control. Stalin suffered a left middle cerebral artery stroke in the early hours of March 1st at his Kuncevo dacha, causing right-sided paralysis and a blood pressure of 190/110. Bound by strict orders never to disturb him, his guards hesitated for hours before entering his quarters. Memoir accounts suggest senior Politburo members delayed summoning medical assistance to assess the unfolding power vacuum. When a team under Professor Nikolai Samoylov arrived on March 2nd, they administered leeches, cold compresses, and magnesium sulfate enemas. Despite these rudimentary efforts, Stalin died at 9:50 p.m. on March 5th, with the official record listing a cerebral hemorrhage. The subsequent radio announcement forced a nation trained in performance to begin public mourning. Yet, in the frozen camps of the Gulag, millions of prisoners quietly hoped their arbitrary confinement would soon end. Stalin's physical absence did not instantly erase the ingrained obedience, suspicion, and terror woven into Soviet society. A country built on total fear was suddenly forced to confront a future without its architect. On March 9th, 1953, the state funeral transformed Moscow into a pressure cooker. Millions of people flooded the streets, funneled by police barricades and heavy military trucks toward the Hall of Columns where Stalin's body lay in state. Mourners moved in a volatile mix of genuine grief, state-mandated duty, and an urgent desire to witness the end of an era. Near Trubnaya Square and the Kremlin Bridge, the sheer volume of the crowd hit a bottleneck. People were packed so tightly that breathing became impossible, and the forward surge turned into a fatal crush. Documented internal records from the Ministry of Internal Affairs later acknowledged at least 109 deaths, though declassified archival estimates suggest the actual toll reached several hundred. To preserve the illusion of flawless national unity, Soviet authorities completely suppressed these casualties from public reporting. Inside the funeral hall, a different struggle unfolded beside the coffin. 4 men stood as honorary guards, positioning themselves to inherit the state: Georgy Malenkov, Vyacheslav Molotov, Nikita Khrushchev, and Lavrentiy Beria. This was a tense, collective leadership arrangement rather than a move toward democratic power sharing. Each man represented a vital pillar of the Soviet system. Malenkov held the government ministry, Khrushchev managed the party apparatus, and Beria controlled the domestic security forces. By guarding the dictator's body together, they sought to project stability to a shaken public, while preparing for a quiet, ruthless contest to secure absolute control over the machinery of empire. On March 27, 1953, only 3 weeks after Stalin's death, Lavrentiy Beria initiated a mass amnesty. The decree released over 1.2 million prisoners, though the vast majority were non-political inmates with sentences under 5 years. On April 4th, the Ministry of Internal Affairs officially ended the doctor's plot, revealing that the accusations against the mainly Jewish physicians had been entirely fabricated through illegal, coercive methods. These sweeping initiatives were not driven by human rights, but by Beria's own bid for political survival. By softening the regime, he sought to cast himself as a modernizer and build a popular base. But Beria's absolute control over the massive security apparatus made him an existential threat to his rivals in the collective leadership. They realized that the man who held the keys to the secret police could eliminate them at any moment. On June 26, 1953, during a routine presidium meeting inside the Kremlin, Nikita Khrushchev and Georgy Malenkov sprung a trap. Marshal Georgy Zhukov led a military contingent into the room, arresting Beria at gunpoint. While later memoirs dispute the exact tactical choreography, the outcome was absolute. The state held a secret trial in December. Charged with treason and sabotage, Beria was convicted and executed by a single gunshot to the head. The reforming security chief was consumed by the very closed, lawless system he had spent his life building. The March 1953 amnesty emptied the camps of petty thieves, but it left the political prisoners behind. This selective release raised expectations and fueled resentment among the millions still locked away. On May 14, 1953, the anger boiled over at the Norilsk camp. Inmates formed a strike committee, elected former party member Ivan Zaitsev as leader, and used semaphore flags to coordinate protests across separated compounds. They drafted handwritten leaflets demanding sentence reviews, a 9-hour workday, improved rations, and an end to arbitrary physical punishments. A parallel strike erupted that July at the Vorkuta coal mining complex, where tens of thousands of prisoners refused to dig. Nikolai Guriev, a former Red Army officer, led the strike committee. When camp administrators tried to negotiate, the prisoners refused to return to the coal mines. On August 1st, Soviet guards opened fire on a crowd of striking inmates, killing dozens. Yet the strikes forced the Ministry of Internal Affairs to standardize food rations, raise caloric intake to 2,300 kilocalories, and reduce work quotas by 15%. The defiance peaked in Kazakhstan at the Kengir camp in May 1954. After guards shot a prisoner named Vladimir Shaposhnikov, 8,000 inmates seized the compound. For 40 days, they ran their own self-governing council with 23 elected representatives, including university professor Alexei Kozlov. The prisoners organized communal kitchens, ran a theater, and even published a camp newspaper called Kengir Voice. The women's colony participated actively, forming a dedicated committee to coordinate food supplies and security. The council demanded basic legal rights and direct negotiations with Moscow. On June 25, 1954, the Soviet state answered with military force. T-34 tanks and armored personnel carriers crashed through the camp perimeter. Soldiers fired on unarmed inmates, killing hundreds of men and women. Survivors watched their self-governing community crushed under tank treads. The rebellions were suppressed, but they changed the dynamic of the state. The regime could no longer ignore the high cost of holding millions of forced laborers at gunpoint. The strikes proved that the Gulag was economically inefficient, politically volatile, and morally unsustainable. On February 25, 1956, delegates at the 20th Party Congress gathered for a closed session inside the Great Kremlin Palace. No foreign reporters were admitted, and no microphones recorded the proceedings. For nearly 4 hours, Nikita Khrushchev delivered a systematic denunciation of the late dictator, accusing Joseph Stalin of cultivating a personal pathology that led to mass purges, fabricated conspiracies, and brutal deportations. Delegates in the hall listened in stunned silence, some reportedly weeping as the myths of their former leader were dismantled before them. The speech shattered decades of state-mandated silence. Although intended solely for internal party ears, copies and summaries circulated worldwide within months. By June, the United States State Department secured a smuggled transcript, prompting the New York Times to publish a translation that exposed the inner workings of Soviet terror to the global public. The British Broadcasting Corporation soon broadcast the text, fueling international debates over the nature of Soviet governance. Yet the speech established strict boundaries on this new truth. Khrushchev focused entirely on Stalin's individual madness and a small circle of accomplices, notably Lavrentiy Beria. He carefully omitted the state-engineered famines of forced collectivization, the systemic nature of the coercive police apparatus, and his own complicity in signing execution lists during the purges. By blaming a singular cult of personality, Khrushchev shielded the wider Communist Party from accountability, protecting the institutional legitimacy of the Soviet state and securing his own position at its head. The myth of Stalin was broken, but the foundations of one-party rule remained untouched. By December 31st, 1958, approximately 4.3 million people were freed from the camps or transferred out of prisoner status. This mass return functioned as an uncertain bureaucratic process rather than an act of public justice. Returnees traveled home with transit papers but received no official apologies, trials for their captors, or financial reparations. For millions, homecoming brought a different kind of isolation. Men and women stepped off trains to find their spouses remarried and their children, raised in silence, unable to recognize them. Families did not know how to talk about the missing years. The state offered no support. Ex-prisoners faced severe housing shortages, often crowded into communal apartments, while local administrators denied them work passports and stable jobs. The stigma of the camps remained. Even worse was the geography of survival. Because the state did not punish the perpetrators, former guards, secret police informers, and active collaborators lived in the same neighborhoods, shared the same hallways, and stood in the same breadlines as their former victims. There was no systemic reckoning. Instead, millions of survivors were forced into daily, silent contact with the people who had signed their arrest warrants or watched them starve. This uneasy peace fractured the social fabric of the nation. It was a reality captured by the poet Anna Akhmatova, who wrote of two Russias staring each other in the eyes, the Russia that suffered and the Russia that sent them. Yet, the physical presence of millions of survivors made absolute silence impossible. Their return permanently damaged the state's ability to conceal its past, ensuring that the quiet of the terror years could never fully return. By 1956, a new vocabulary was filling sports arenas and university halls. Young poets like Yevgeny Yevtushenko, Andrei Voznesensky, and Bella Akhmadulina stood before microphone podiums, declaiming verse to stadium crowds of thousands. At the 1957 Youth Festival, the long band syncopations of jazz returned with groups like Diki Gul playing openly in Moscow. For a brief moment, the language of everyday public life expanded, shedding the rigid, wooden formulas of the Stalin era. But this cultural opening had rigid political borders. In November 1956, Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest, deploying 120,000 troops to crush the Hungarian Revolution and kill thousands of demonstrators. 2 years later, the state turned its weight against Boris Pasternak. When the Swedish Academy awarded him the 1958 Nobel Prize for Dr. Zhivago, the Soviet Writers' Union expelled him, and intense official pressure forced him to send a telegram rejecting the award to avoid permanent exile. Even de-Stalinization remained a top-down, strictly managed process. On the night of October 31, 1961, a ceremonial guard unit quietly removed Stalin's embalmed body from the Lenin Mausoleum, reburying it under a modest marble slab near the Kremlin wall. The state executed this physical eviction in near-total darkness, completely bypassing any public debate, mass ritual, or open national reckoning. A year later, in November 1962, the literary journal Novy Mir published Alexander Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. The novella offered Soviet readers their first raw, uncensored look at the daily survival of a Gulag prisoner. Yet, this historic event happened only because Nikita Khrushchev personally read the manuscript and approved its printing to serve his own political goals. Selective permission remained distinct from genuine freedom of expression or institutional reform. The state permitted discussions of the terror only so far as it served the leadership, retaining absolute control over the boundaries of memory, while those two Russias continued staring each other in the eyes. When Khrushchev was ousted in October 1964 and replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, the temporary opening began to contract. The state tried to lock the doors of history once more, but the intellectual seeds of the thaw had already taken root. A generation of writers and readers had learned to speak, and their networks would soon form the foundation of the underground dissident movement. Once the silence was broken, it became clear that fear couldn't silence a nation forever. Watch part 1 of this series by clicking the link in the description, and subscribe for more deep dive history documentaries. In October 1964, the Communist Party leadership removed Nikita Khrushchev from power. Leonid Brezhnev assumed the role of first secretary, bringing an end to the unpredictable experiments of the previous decade. The new leadership established bureaucratic stability to avoid further political risk, choosing to preserve the existing state rather than rebuild Stalin's total terror. As the state reasserted control over public expression and tightened censorship, the boundaries of the thaw narrowed. Coercive bodies remained under state control, but the monopoly over memory was permanently fractured. The millions of citizens who had returned from the camps, the circulated literary works, and the memory of official disclosures could not be erased. This shared inheritance of exposed history, smuggled manuscripts, and personal testimonies provided the language and networks that sustained the later dissident movement. Long before the open reforms of the 1980s, the barrier of absolute silence had been breached. The state could police the borders of expression, but fear couldn't silence a nation forever. Watch part 1 through the link below, and subscribe for more historical documentaries. Today, those two Russias still stare each other in the eyes, their unresolved history shaping the modern world. The physical camps are gone, but the struggle between state control and the human voice continues. Because once the silence was broken, it proved that fear couldn't silence a nation forever. Watch part 1 through the link below and subscribe for more.